as a conversation, because I think it would make sense, that the idea is that the general topic is the proportion in this sound in a multi-layered texture in the piano literature. And two general comments about piano literature. We have vast majority of a lot of repertoire that is written for piano. So we're lucky we have all this diversity. We don't have to take from some other instrument and just make an arrangement. So we have a lot of stylistic periods, literature, and when you look at this from the general observation, you think, well, every style, every composer is really completely different. You have a lot of, you have to have almost a special approach to each of them, which is partially true when it comes to kind of general understanding of Brahms versus Chopin, Chopin versus Mozart, Mozart versus Prokofiev. Of course, they're different because the music itself is different. When you start to try to analyze what we do when we play the instrument or we teach, we ultimately deal with sound and the time. Those are two major components. Now, there's nothing else in music. It's the sound and the sound that appears in time. So we're manipulating those two. Now, okay, so then once it comes to sound and time, all composers pretty much fall into the same thing. Brahms has sound, Mozart has sound, Prokofiev has sound, and they all evolve in time. Okay, so there's something that connects everyone. Now, when it comes to proportioning the sound in the musical texture, it's after so many years of teaching and playing, and a lot of, because of teaching, because you have to try to explain to students and try to find the full formula that will pretty much teach them to apply on the next piece, so they don't have to teach them from ground up again. I kind of formed my opinion on this. I don't think it's a unique opinion because the majority of the musicians follow it, but I basically create for myself a system that works. And then variations within this system, are they possible? Of course. Exceptions, of course, there can be. Now, so when we deal with multi-layered texture, we have two major, again, components in the musical language. Music divides on melodic material and something that comes along with the melody. That's, I always say music speaks in melodies. And if you think about it, what is the melody's function in the texture? The melody speaks. Yes, we can think about colorful images and everything. It's part of it. But what does the melody do? The melody is trying to say something, express something. So what's the function of the rest that comes along with the melody? The rest, if it's non-melodic, it provides the environment. Environment can be passive, it can be very vibrant. But when the melody is present, that means the melody is talking, the rest is complementing it and tries not to interfere. And that's how music works. If you go and listen opera, when soprano is singing, no one can play it louder than soprano. She's not going to be happy. So it's with the rest of the voices. So idea is, while they're singing, of course, they transmitting emotions through their sound and some verbal information. So they speaking, so the melody speaks. So, all right, so we have those two basic entities. Now, so the first sound proportions that we have to always remember, and we know about it, melody is louder, accompaniment is softer. And so, what we just did right now, then the question becomes to what degree? The next thing, once you balance your melody with the rest of the notes and you start to think about horizontal part of it, shaping. So what do you do with shaping? Are there some rules that are similar from composer to composer with all their differences? Or every time when you play Prokofiev, he has different recipes for phrasing versus Chopin. So without long introductions, and maybe leave more time for me to demonstrate and maybe questions and answers, I believe that, and I don't think I'm the only one, and I don't think I invented this, I just simply from observation, I came to the conclusion that's how it works, that the balance between primary and secondary has to be wide enough for the primary, which is melodic, to be phrased without secondary overlapping it. So the basic rule for this sound proportions that I use for myself and for my students is that if you're playing in piano, pianissimo, mezzo piano, mezzo forte, dynamic level, the non-melodic material, secondary, has to be at least twice as soft than the rest. What is twice as soft? I didn't measure it, but once you say it, you kind of have an idea how to adjust it. Now, the next thing, while the melody is getting shaped, the accompaniment, especially if it's non-linear secondary voice, is not getting shaped and barely reacts on the phrasing in the melody. The only time when the accompanimental material gets more involved into dynamic or growth, if it's either linear or you're building up to big climatic moment. And the formula that I use for the sound is such that, let's say, this is the melody, whatever that, somewhere there. This is your accompaniment, nice enough room, so your melody is getting shaped, going up and down, your accompaniment stays pretty much just like the wallpaper, it just doesn't do anything. So then from this point, you have to arrive to a climatic moment, let's say a forte or fortissimo. So the way I usually deal with the sound, my melodies start to crescendo first, my accompaniment material stays non-reactive. About halfway through, when the melody separates enough, my accompaniments start to help. And then when it gets close to the climatic moment, depends on how it's written, your accompaniment material secondary gets very close to the melody. You still want to try to retain identity of the melodies without being completely swallowed. So in piano literature, it is possible. There are a few instances where you just simply play with full force. If you play Rachmaninoff Concerto No. 2, forget it in a lot of places. You can just play anything because the orchestra pretty much covers you. So on the recordings, in a recording state, you can hear the piano, but in the actual live situation, sometimes you just see the pianist moving their hands, and maybe you catch one note here and another note there. What happens in between, you just simply don't, the orchestra blocks it. So we're talking about the solo literature. So now, the next, once you reach the climatic point, let's imagine you have to diminuendo. My formula for diminuendo that I use, which works very well, is, this is your melody, this is your accompaniment. You are at the peak of the sound, and then you have to start to drop it down. Let's say you have 2 or 3 or 4 measures of relaxing the sound. My accompaniment starts to drop noticeably, while the melody is adjusting very little. So while the accompaniment giving that room for the melody, because we're going away from the most intense dynamic to the mid-range dynamic, where the melody has to have its flexibility to phrase. So accompaniment gives its way to the melody. Melodic line declines gradually. Accompaniment drops down and then it just starts to wait. Not in a matter of 2 or 3 notes, but you just, every time you have to evaluate how soon your accompaniment has to, secondary voices should diminuendo. Usually it's fairly noticeably and rather dramatically fast drop in the sound while the melody isn't. And then after that, you arrive to diminuendo point where the dynamic level is, you back to your normal proportions. So that's the basic balance aspect of the sound. It's a little bit easier. So the more complicated one, which is actually less complicated, no, it's actually not that complicated, but has more variations, is when we shape the melody, forget about the rest of the notes. What are the choices for increasing the sound or dropping the sound based on? Because when we look at the music score, we see a general dynamic level. And a lot of composers, even specific composers as Beethoven and Ravel that like to control everything, they leave a lot of open areas. They write F, they don't write so that you have to gradually get louder here on that note and gradually softer there. That's left up to the musical language to speak and the pianist or musician to know. So I believe that most of the choices in shaping melodic line are summarized by, I think, 3 or 4 components. It's direction, up or down. We usually tend to get stronger when we go up. We usually get to relax the sound when it goes down. Other exceptions, of course. But most of the time, that's what we have. If there is no special marking in the score says diminuendo as it goes up, or crescendo as it goes down, and the general dynamic is, let's say, mezzo forte or piano, and there's nothing else. Usually that's what we do. Can we change it? Of course. So that's the first component, going up or down, direction. The second is longer or shorter notes. We usually, if you think about it when we phrase, and I will demonstrate it a little bit, we usually play longer notes a little bit stronger, and we usually shape toward the long notes. So, for example, if the melodic line climbing upstairs reaches the highest point, curves down, and arrives to the long note on the downbeat, we usually phrase toward that note, not to the highest. Usually, not always. But majority of the time, that's what we do. So the gravity of the longer note is pretty important in choosing our shaping dynamic. And so it's long, short notes. And the next component, which is just about the last one, is upbeats and downbeats. When I was little, I didn't really pay attention to it. But if you think about it, we favor primary beats in a measure. Of course, it depends on how the rhythm is written. We favor them more versus the lighter beats. When the rhythm is uniform, it can guide us for a pretty long period of time into the arrival point. It goes through all the beats over the bar lines, and there is the arrival. Okay, so we go to the long note right there. But still, when we arrive, we usually arrive to the stronger beat. Now, one of the exceptions is when the long note positioned on the light beat that goes syncopation. So therefore, that's a rhythmic accent against the metric accent. So therefore, we favor in this note, and that's composers do it on purpose. They place in a half note in 4/4 on the second beat. They want that note to be emphasized. You can see sometimes in the same piece of music, you have first and the second beat written as quarter, quarter, rest on the third beat, and the quarter on the fourth beat. We do ti-dum, and then ta-dum, going to the downbeat. And then same composer, 8 measures later writes quarter, whole note, and half note, followed by the quarter. So is there a difference in sound in the situation? Of course it is. That's why he wrote the whole note on the weak beat, because he wanted us to be a little bit more emphasized. How much, that would be the question. So in the last kind of sub-component, it's our choices, dynamic choices based on also where we are in the phrase. Usually at the end of the phrase, we relax the sound, regardless where things go. But even when you're relaxing the sound, we're still fully aware we're not bringing out weak beats. We always relax on the stronger beat. Or if the last note is a lighter beat, that note will be the lightest. So, and that's pretty much it. So when you apply this kind of thinking or evaluation or planning on when you shape a melodic line, you will realize that pretty much most of the time you do this in Bach, you do this in Mozart, you do this in Haydn, you do this in Chopin, you do this in Prokofiev. So on that level, music language is similar. The differences come when you start to zoom out from that and how you build your plan your structural dynamic, how much pedal you use, how much timing you allow to flow and breathe, and then of course combination of notes that composer wrote. So in to try to do, and then the other thing, I talked about the small stuff. In general also, there is such thing as, I believe, the structural dynamic, and there is such thing as an expressive dynamic. It's a little black and white kind of statement. They, of course, influence both structure and expression. But that microdynamic that I was just talking about, shaping and phrasing, is the first one that we react to when we listen. So this one we pretty much identify as more expressive narrative in music. Because melody has to speak expressively, so these fluctuations based on those basic guidelines, direction, short, long notes, and upbeats and downbeats. It's an immediate something that our ear catches, so it is an expressive, or more seem to be, sounds like an expressive dynamic. Structural dynamic is what you see in a score. You have a marked certain dynamic level at the beginning of the piece, then you see, let's say, the minuendo, then you see piano here, then you see climatic dynamic. That is a structural thing that also has to be proportioned. But we only appreciate this dynamic when we listen somebody play. We might, if it's done well and clearly, we might appreciate this in retrospect as the piece is ending. It's like, yeah, I heard the structures and I'm realizing how the whole thing came to be. Of course, if you listen to the recording several times, then you start to appreciate structural thinking of the musician who plays whatever the piece that you're listening to. So that kind of requires more than one time to listen to really fully embrace. So the structural dynamic versus expressive, immediate, microdynamic, microphrasing is those two that I always try to keep in mind when I work with my repertoire and work with students. And we usually, what we get at best when we teach students, because we have so much to deal with, and we get the more or less structural dynamic in place, and that microdynamic sometimes has certain discrepancies. And I noticed that in my teaching, until I get rid of all the junk in the sound, I cannot go to the next level, because even if you have an attempt to talk about imagery, not every student can immediately adjust the sound. Because if they don't hear that the accompaniment is too loud, talking about the trees and the birds, not necessarily going to make his left hand softer. You have to tell softer, but then you have to explain why it is soft, because in the next piece you're hoping that he or she will do it on their own, and you don't have to spend time teaching them that again. So it seemed to be that fine polish and dynamic, before I get to the structural dynamic, takes quite a bit of time. Explaining basic guidelines and rules actually help, and it helps you even with the younger kids, 9, 10 years old. They do understand that concept, and later it takes just a reminder that you haven't followed those, and they do react on this if they forgot to do it on their own. And eventually many of them just do it without you going back into the fundamentals and again explain them that how the apples and oranges are different. So once that is all proportioned, there is expression. Expression is what basically the goal, what we are striving for. Because the structure, yes, has to be sound, it has to be proportioned on all this small little level, and then on the structural level. But then after that, this is the intellectual part of our work. The artistic part is how you feel about it. And that how you feel about it adjust those components. But adjustment doesn't mean you're going to turn things upside down. You're not going to accent something that's supposed to be lighter, you're not going to play something light that's supposed to be deeper. So with that in mind, just a few examples how that can be implemented, or I wouldn't say it should be and must be, but again, when you look at even the simple pieces that you work with, just notice, let's talk about, let's say, balance. accompaniment is not following the shaping of the melody. My kind of basic rule, unless it's linear and unless I build a big crescendo to like some climatic point. So for example, if you're a student playing, this is a passive accompaniment. I mean, it's moving, it's faster, but it's passive, it doesn't do anything. So, I have melodic line in the right hand. So, let's imagine, I mean, we do get, so that's no, because it's too loud. Now, we usually get happy when that happens. And often we stop there and just say, well, they got that. Well, I usually say, well, that's good. But let's make it gooder. So, and then my goal in, for example, in something like this is, it has no melodic value. It has some rhythmic thing. No interest of dissonance or anything. So, this is a bland beige on the wall. So, and it's supposed to be bland and beige because it's non-linear. So, therefore, I ask students to separate that even more. So it's you know, it's a little bit more work. Now, imagine if my accompaniment in this situation, which is passive, it happens a lot. It's not always Alberti based, it can be just non-melodic chords. If that going to start to follow the shaping of the melody, which is it just doesn't sound right. Why? Because it's a secondary non-melodic material. It should shut up and just sit in its corner. So, but with kids, often when they start shape primary voice, they also shape the secondary, because our brain can do similar stuff easier than the opposite. So that's that. Now, for example, if you have to build up to a big climatic point, then of course your accompaniment, actually I'm trying to think what on top of my head what I can demonstrate with, but your accompanimental voice is going to be building. So next thing, phrasing, and I will start with light and give you a few a little bit more complex examples, but it will work pretty much the same. So it's now if you try to analyze my sound, the reason I'm dropping the sound, that's actually another thing to keep remembering, the slurs, because when it comes to phrasing, the length of the slur and where the slur is leading us pretty much tells us how to shape. We have that, in Baroque is usually not much written, in Viennese classical we see quite a bit of it, and then we see it actually in Romantic and we see it in the 20th century, because a lot of 20th century writing is neoclassical, so they use these short motivic groups to build longer phrase. So therefore when a composer writes 4 notes under the slur, and then the arrival note in the next measure sits by itself, what do we have to do with the sound? We lead into that note. Are we crescendoing in that short motivic group, or we diminuendo? Some musicians believe short motivic groups of the same value, with the last note being on the lighter beat, meant diminuendo. We always play the second note lighter. Now, that said, if the same 2 notes positioned first on the lighter beat and the second on the stronger beat, the second note becomes the arrival note. So the stronger beat affects our sound choices. If your last note under the slur is not on the stronger beat, you have an opportunity to breathe goes over the bar line into that quarter, then of course. And again, in the same composition, by the same composer, you can see a slur going over the bar line. Not too much in Mozart or Haydn, but you see it in Beethoven. 8 notes guiding to the quarter, there is a slur going over the bar line. Next, 8 notes, quarter, the slur ends on last note of the 8th, and then the quarter comes after. Do you have to differentiate the sound between those two? Why he chose one time this way, the other time that way? So there is a breathing point there, and that could be a subject of argument between musicians, and that's wonderful because there's no one way of thinking it. So what I'm trying to do usually and ask my students is to be careful with that last note that you think is part of the crescendo into the main arrival note. Because otherwise there will be no distinction between those two slurs. So when you have, no problem, when you have, the argument would be, but it breaks the melodic line. Well, composer probably wanted that. The big argument, let's say for example, that's a notorious example that back in the day when I learned this sonata, in my editions there, it was a one long slur covering 4 measures. And that's how I play. So, well, you look at the Rosnianski edition, and they clearly write. So, over the period of years thinking about it and playing this, I believe I have to honor breathing and I have to honor sound fluctuation in that case. Now, and so, as you notice, I had quite a few arrival notes. They were all either longer or fell on stronger beats. And then also, between those primary notes, if you will, arrival notes, I also try to control my sound based on their position. It seems to be a simple thing, but, and you say, well, that's obvious, you have to do it, but do we do it? Do we always follow it? That would be also questionable. Now, let's check if, for example, let's check something a little bit more complex, like Chopin, for example. A little bit. So I'm shaping there. So my shaping dynamic is still respecting longer notes versus shorter, and it's still respecting longer notes falling on the stronger beats versus lighter. So the shorter notes becoming bridges to the arrival notes. I do exactly the same thing in Mozart. I need to arrive to a longer note there. 5 minutes? Yeah. So, let's play something more. Isolate my melodic voice, it again follows the same guidelines. Now, in talking about balancing and secondary voices, in this case, in this specific example, when I play this ballad, I actually favor implied melodic voices versus the one that we already heard a couple of times in the previous pages. So the possibilities are such. And again, in order to make that visible, you have to establish your balance. Once the balance is established wide enough, we start to identify this as a primary voice versus the rest becoming secondary, including the primary melody that was heard many times. The next thing, I have to figure out my phrasing dynamic, and it falls exactly into the same basic categories. Under the melodic voice, and it's up to me either show them or not. So again, hiding there. But doesn't matter what I'm doing with this. I have to balance it and I have to shape it. So when I balance, if I balance just enough so that I know about it, you're not going to appreciate it. I have to bring it out enough so that you actually start to forget or not listen to the other voice and say, oh, that's what I'm feeding right now. He's giving us this kind of menu. And then from this menu, so to say, you have to organize sound horizontally, and it's exactly the same thing. As soon as you fall out of those basic necessities for shaping, you either accenting or your shaping is inconsistent, you're favoring the notes that shouldn't be favored, and when you play by yourself, we often don't hear